Hello folks. In my previous video, we'll learn how to create a small a website using the HTML and CSS. So if you haven't got a chance to watch that, please go ahead and watch my previous video. And this video specifically, I'm going to cover how we can define a variable in Angular and how the Angular variables works. Basically, we have two types of variables, which is one-way binding and two-way binding. I'm going to explain everything from the scratch. Let's get started. So define a variable in Angular. You have to go to TS, component.ts. So you look at here, this is what the page shows currently. Let's say, how do you define a variable? First of all, what is variable? If you are new to the programming language, so basically variable is a small block of storage where you can store your value and reuse it wherever you want it. Let's say, let me create a variable. So variable my input and your data type. So in Angular, so you need to start with your user defined variable name colon data types. So there are different data types. You have any. So basically any indicate it's accept any types, any sort of variables, values, and you have numbers. So numbers indicates you can store only numbers, and boolean indicates you can store either true or false, and you have string. So string store pretty much everything. um, okay, let's put any in this example. Okay, so now I defined a variable. This is called variable. So now let's see how we can use this variable in your HTML. Let's say I have a HTML and I have a small div, and I have a message inside the div hello Angular. So what I'm trying to do now, let me add a variable here. I didn't want to use the hard coded value. Instead, let me try using the variable I defined. If you look at that variable, just copy it simple straightforward, go to the Angular HTML. So we are going to use I'm sorry, one-way binding. So what is, let's see, what is one-way and two-way binding. So basically one-way binding is the variable define the values will be used in the HTML labels or any sort of labels, params and headers. So one-way variable, which means that when you change something in the TS file, it get reflected in the HTML. Whereas two-way binding, where when you update something on the variable, it reflects in the HTML. At the same time, when you update in value in the HTML, it also reflects the uh, variable. For example, you write a variable and there is an input file, for example text. You enter some text in the value in HTML. Again, that value gets stored in variable. So it's a two-way binding. So how do we define one way and two way in HTML? To use the single binding, you need to use this syntax, and if you want to use two-way binding, you need to use this syntax. So this is the syntax you have to use. Basically, here is the variable name. To you, this particular single binding always comes with the default package, whereas for the two-way binding, you need to additionally import form module. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's go back and define the variable. So as discussed, we are going to use single binding. This binding. Okay, let's define. Let me copy this variable and go back. Let me remove and add the variable. Okay, that's it. So now let's go and see. So now you don't see the values in the div. Why? Because you just initialize the div data types, but there's no value assigned. Okay, let's add a value. uh, um, let's say this is my input variable. and you see error, right? Why? Because to initialize the data types you have to use colon, whereas to as initialize the values you need to use this. So now the error is gone. Let's see what you see. Okay, look at that. So whatever the value you assign to the variable, and you use the variable here, and now it's in the HTML. Yeah, this is really simple and straightforward in Angular and more powerful. Let's say, let me change the variable here. Hello Angular. Save this. So you get hello Angular. So whatever the value you assign, it just reflected in the div class. So similarly, you can use any variable and assign the values to the variable. It get reflected in HTML. I think you understand this one-way binding where you assign the value, it's binded to the HTML label. So let's look at how we can use two-way binding, which means that you assign a value, you add a value, it shows in HTML input, and when you make changes in the input, assign back to the variable. Okay. Let's say I'm gonna create label. The name is enter email. Okay, let me create text, input type text. Okay, now let's see how it looks. Let's go back to the page. Okay, now you see a label, enter email. I enter the email, but nothing happened, and this is not getting stored anywhere. Because let's say, like, take a login form. You enter a value in the login form, and that get captured in a variable, and that goes in the backend to validate the authentication, right? So eventually you have to capture the values enter into the text box. That's where the variable comes into picture. Let's say what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a variable, my text box input value, and let me define any. Okay, now I'm going to get this value. So I'm going to, if anybody enter the value, I just want to store that information into that variable. So we already seen how to define the two-way binding. Okay, let's define the two-way binding. NgModel, and assign this variable name. So this is the syntax: NgModel and equal to the variable name. So basically whatever the input you're given, it get captured here and assigned to this variable. And if this variable not defined, you will get the error. So now you assign the variable, but you see here, right? So you see here there is a error showing here, as I said earlier. So to add the NgModel, this is not comes default in the package. So you need to add the package you needed for two-way binding. Okay, so to do that you have to go to app.module.ts, where you get all the modules package get imported. Let's import forms control, forms module. Okay, so now you get the model. Just copy this model name. You have to import that model to your package. So now save it. Look at that. So after you get the form modules, an error is gone. Now let's go back to your, go to the variable. Now we can type. So this, whatever you're typing here, it getting saved in the variable, but there is no way you can see that variable in here, right? So let's do one thing. Let me add a variable. Let me add a label. So now the label, I'm going to display my input. and let me add another label. So now let's see. So what I'm going to do, whatever I'm typing here, it should come to this particular label. I have another label, let's say uh, input. So input, let's say the space. So what I'm going to type here, it should come this particular, it should be replaced here. How do I do it? So the thing is, you're gonna type something here, it should go back to this variable assign, and this variable is again used in the different label. Let's say I create a different label, my input label, my input label. Now I'm gonna just bind these values back to this, whatever the input coming. Let's see how it works. I don't want to save this one. Okay, let's say I'm going to use the variable, because now I'm using the one-way binding, because I'm going to do one-way binding here. Once the two-way binding completed, let's say what's the variable name we are storing. I'm storing into the my text box value, right? Let's do this one. Let me save that. Okay, let's go and see how it works. Look at that. I type here the data coming here. How is it possible? Because when I enter something here, it gets stored into this variable. This variable value getting stored, and then I just get this value and display in the label. Hello, how are you? Yeah, it looks fun, right? It looks really good. So this is where you have to do the two-way binding. So now we are in general case, we what we do, we capture this value. For example, I enter the email ID. I need to use the email ID and do some validation, and if I want to do any authentication with any other service or database, I would use some function to call the API and validate it and show the result. But here just we are learning how to use variable and use single and two-way binding. It's very simple example. When we go in future videos, we will learn in a real-time example how we can use these variables. I hope you understand now how we can create a variable and do the single or one-way binding and two-way binding, and how do we import and add this syntax. And very important here is you need to import this package, because form modules, the ng models under the form models, if you don't have form models in here, it will not support ng model, the two-way binding. So you need to include this package, you need to import from the forms, and you have to add in the import section, so it get imported. Then you can use the ng module here, this section. I hope now you understand how you define the variable, how you assign the value to variable, what are the data types we have, and how to use the one-way binding, how to use the two-way binding using NgModel, and how to assign the value back from the two-way binding. I'm really I hope so it will be helpful. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please like my channel and subscribe. We have a lot more coming up. Thank you so much for watching.